Hey everybody, I hope you guys are doing well. So what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm actually going to record the anatomy section of our lung and respiratory system PowerPoint so that we can spend the class time doing the physiology section. So just know this is a section that you're going to have to read perhaps or listen to on your own time, but I wanted to go ahead and record this for you guys so that you have this, so that you have some sort of explanations of things. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So as I just mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and read the anatomy section of the respiratory system. I am going to stop my video. Okay. So as for the learning goals, I'm going to basically cover the first two, I would say, and then I'll leave the last three for our face-to-face lecture. So here's a short video on why this is relevant and why this matters. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for you guys.
Every cell in your body requires a steady stream of oxygen in order to function. The respiratory system is responsible for bringing oxygen into the body and getting rid of the carbon dioxide that cells produce when they use oxygen. In this chapter, you will learn how the respiratory system provides your body with the oxygen that is vital to life. Since the respiratory system brings oxygen from the air into the body, it is wide open to all elements in the air, including airborne pathogens. As a result, the respiratory system is especially susceptible to infectious diseases. This explains why some of the most frequent ailments that healthcare professionals are likely to encounter are respiratory disorders, like laryngitis, bronchitis, influenza, and the common cold. In order to assess and treat these patients, you must first understand the various components of the respiratory system and how they function. For example, knowing that the nasal mucosa is continuous with the mucosa of the respiratory tract allows you to predict the typical progress of the common cold, with symptoms first affecting the nose and nasal passages, then moving to the throat, and finally ending with symptoms affecting the chest, like coughing. By having a solid understanding of the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system, you will be able to properly treat your patients who exhibit symptoms of the common cold and other respiratory disorders. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, I'm going to cover part one, the respiratory system functional anatomy, in this video lecture. So we break up the respiratory system into the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract is going to include things like the nose and the nasal cavity, the paranasal sinuses, which we are all pretty familiar with at this point because I know I've mentioned them before, and also the pharynx, which is the throat. The lower respiratory tract is going to include the larynx, trachea, bronchi and their branches, the lungs, and also the alveoli, which are not present on this particular diagram, but we'll talk about them. So let's go ahead and move through each of these structures in this PowerPoint. So the upper respiratory system, the upper respiratory tract, is going to have the job of warming, humidifying, and filtering the air. So in this section, we're going to talk about the location, structures, functions of the nose, the paranasal sinuses, and also the pharynx. And we're going to list and describe several different protective mechanisms of the respiratory system. So first and foremost is the nose. This is actually the only external portion of the respiratory system, and it is subdivided into two regions. So first region being the external nose, and then secondly, the nasal cavity. So what you see on your face would be the external nose, and then deeper we find the nasal cavity.
And the nose has the job of, one, providing an airway for respiration, so for breathing in and out. Also, it has the job of moistening and warming air that comes in to the respiratory system. In addition, it filters and it cleans the air that you're breathing in, and serves as a resonating chamber for when you're speaking. And finally, as we all know already, that it houses olfactory receptors up on the top of the nasal cavity. Remember, the olfactory tract that then goes back and enters the brain through the first cranial nerve that sends signals whenever we are smelling. So moving on from the nose is next the paranasal sinuses, and these form sort of a ring around the nasal cavities, as you can kind of see from this diagram. This is going to include the frontal sinus. We have the sphenoid sinus, which you can really only see laterally, and you can see that it's just inferior to the pituitary gland. Additionally, we have the ethmoid sinuses, which are located just deep to the lateral bridges of the nose. And then finally, the maxillary sinuses, which are kind of embedded within the maxillary bones. They're kind of pockets of empty air-filled openings in the maxillary bones. And so the paranasal sinuses have the job of, number one, lightening the skull. So when you add air to something, it kind of helps to lighten the weight. They also secrete mucus, and then finally warm and moisten incoming air. So whenever you have a sinus infection, for example, that would be an infection that's going to be within one of or multiple of these air-filled cavities within the bones. Moving on to the next structure in the upper respiratory tract is going to be the pharynx. And the pharynx is going to be sort of this funnel-shaped muscular tube that runs from the base of the skull all the way to C6 vertebra. Its job is pretty much just to connect the nasal cavity and also the mouth to the larynx and the esophagus. And the pharynx is composed of skeletal muscle and is broken into 3 different regions. So the uppermost region is called the nasopharynx because it's sort of directly connected to the nose. This middle region is called the oropharynx because it's the region just behind the mouth. And then finally, the most inferior region of the pharynx is called the laryngopharynx. And the reason for that is because it is just posterior or just behind the larynx. So let's talk about each of these regions a little bit more in depth. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about the nasopharynx. This is the air passageway that's posterior to the nasal cavity, and it is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The soft palate, which we can see here, and the uvula, which is that little dangly thing in the back of your throat, actually close during swallowing. So whenever you're eating food and you go to swallow, the soft palate and the uvula actually swing back here and they block off the nasopharynx so that food does not go and come out the nose. Rather, it will go down the remainder of the pharynx. Located within the nasopharynx, we find the pharyngeal tonsils, which you can see here. These are also commonly called the adenoids, so it's located again on the posterior wall. And additionally, the pharyngeotympanic tubes, or the eustachian tube, or the auditory tube. We've talked about this tube before, so this is about where the ear would be located. And the pharyngeotympanic tubes, again, as a reminder, just help to drain and equalize pressure that's in the middle ear, and they actually open into the lateral walls. So when your ears pop, it's because this pharyngeotympanic tube is allowing pressure inside of the middle ear, and in the external environment, like when you're chewing, you're breathing in regular air, it's allowing those pressures to equalize. Next is the oropharynx, and the oropharynx is the passageway for food and air from the level of the soft palate to the epiglottis. So it's basically this region from soft palate, so here down to the epiglottis, which you can see is this sort of blue-like structure here. This is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, and some important markings here are going to include things like the isthmus of Fauces, which is just the opening to the oral cavity. So when you chew food and you start to propel it down the back of your throat, the opening that it enters is first this isthmus of Fauces. Also, we have the palatine tonsils here. So those are the tonsils that you see at the back of your throat if you still have tonsils. And then finally, we have the lingual tonsils, which are kind of located on this posterior surface of the tongue. Okay, so we can see the lingual tonsils there. This structure that you're seeing here, it looks kind of muscular because it is, that's the tongue itself, okay? So moving on to the sort of bottom section then is the laryngopharynx. This is a shared pathway for both food and air and is posterior to the upright epiglottis. So in this instance, the epiglottis is upright. And so this section here is our laryngopharynx. This actually extends to the larynx, where it is also continuous with the esophagus and is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. So just kind of a little bit of a heads up into future about digestive system, for example. Whenever you swallow food, what happens is that this epiglottis, go ahead and get my little drawing tool. The epiglottis is actually going to fold over. I'm going to block this segment so that food can go down the esophagus, and so also that food does not go down the windpipe. Although, if it does go down the windpipe, then you have reached the epiglottis. Okay, maybe the epiglottis didn't close properly, or you were talking and eating at the same time, you just weren't ready to swallow yet. A lot of times that will cause the breach of the epiglottis, and that's when you start choking a little bit on your own food, or people often say it went down the wrong pipe, because it literally, as you can see, would be going down the wrong pipe if the food came over here. Okay. All right. So this is just a summary of basically everything that I just said about the different structures of the upper respiratory tract and their functions. So now we can move on to the lower respiratory tract, and this is going to consist of the conducting and respiratory zone structures. So we'll talk about the difference between conducting versus respiratory zones, describe structure, function, and location of larynx, trachea, and bronchi, talk about the makeup of the respiratory membrane and related structure to its function, and finally identify the organs that form the respiratory passageway in descending order from the top basically all the way to the alveoli. Okay, so as a reminder, the lower respiratory tract is going to include the larynx, trachea, so the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi and all of their branches, and then also the lungs. And so we actually break the lower respiratory tract into two zones. And the zone is going to be based on kind of the function. So first is the conducting zone, and pretty much the conducting zone is kind of like a train conductor or a traffic conductor, in that basically they just directs air to the functional region. So it's a conduit that transports gas to and from the gas exchange sites. So basically think of the larynx, the trachea, the primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi as being these conductors that are just trying to get air to where it's going. Next is the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone is actually going to be where gas exchange is actually happening. So this is going to include things like the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. So here we would see then these respiratory or alveolar ducts and respiratory bronchioles, and then each little circle that you see here is an alveolus. And so if we zoom in on an alveolus, here would be one single alveolus. And the alveoli are wrapped heavily by these capillary beds. So the arterial side and the sort of CO2 rich side, so that we drop off carbon dioxide into the alveoli and we put oxygen from the alveoli onto the capillaries. All right, so let's talk a little bit first about the larynx. The larynx is going to go from approximately the third to the sixth cervical vertebra and is also attached to the hyoid bone. It opens into the laryngopharynx, which again is just behind the larynx, behind the epiglottis region, so the part that my spotlight is on right now. And the larynx itself is also continuous with the trachea. And inside the larynx, you'll find the vocal folds, and also you'll find this epiglottis, which we already talked about, that being the flap that kind of covers the laryngopharynx whenever you are swallowing, so that food actually travels down the esophagus and not down the trachea. So the functions of the larynx are to provide a patent airway and to route air and food into their proper channels, or into their proper pipes, if you will. And also, because it houses the vocal folds, this is going to be the part that's responsible for the production of our voices. So again, so I kind of already explained this, being the epiglottis kind of folding down, but the epiglottis is made of elastic cartilage. And so during swallowing, that elastic cartilage just covers the opening of the larynx. And this is what allows food to flow into the esophagus and not down the trachea. Interestingly, the epiglottis is actually covered in taste bud containing mucosa. And so when those taste buds are being stimulated, and whenever food actually comes in contact with the epiglottis, that stimulates it to fold down. And so the bolus of food can move down the esophagus. Okay, so continuing on with the larynx, I mentioned that it houses the vocal folds, or the vocal cords. And so just a little bit of anatomy about that. This would be an endoscope that's going down into the throat and allowing us to see the vocal folds. So first we have the vocal ligaments, which are considered the true vocal folds. So just to draw that like a more clear arrow for you guys. We have the true vocal cords, that one and that one. Those are true. And these lack blood supply. The opening that is between the true vocal cords, so here's a true and here's a true. The opening that's between them is called, well, I'll just draw over that, the glottis. And so how this works is that the vocal folds actually, they vibrate to produce sounds as air is rushing up from the lungs. And so in addition to having these true vocal folds, we also have false vocal folds, or false vocal cords. And these are going to be superior to the vocal folds. So you can see one here and one over here as well. And the false vocal cords or the false vocal folds, they have actually really no part in sound production, but they do help to close the epiglottis during swallowing. So here's the epiglottis, just so we're aware. And the epiglottis is, again, remember, going to fold over and cover this opening so that food does not go down the trachea. In terms of producing sound, speech itself is caused by the intermittent release of expired air during the opening and closing of the glottis. Pitch is determined by how lengthened these vocal cords are. Loudness depends on the force of expired air. So you make your voice louder by actually exhaling more forcefully. The pharynx, oral, nasal, and sinus cavities then will amplify that sound and enhance the sound's quality. And that makes then the job of language being sound that has been shaped into words and into specific sounds by the muscles of the pharynx, the tongue, the soft palate, and also the lips. So I have this video clip on here, and these are actually the vocal folds of a woman who is singing. So again, human speech and also song results from interaction between the elastic muscles and aerodynamics, or the movement of air. So as we exhale, the folds are actually officially, they're kind of initially pushed apart, and then the flow of air moving past past these folds is what creates sort of this low pressure situation, also called the Bernoulli effect, that helps to pull the folds back together. And as the folds close, high pressure again is going to force them to open. And so it sets the cycle of oscillation, or basically vibration that's producing sound. So you can see them kind of like flapping together before they fully open. So that's when she's like saying a big note, is like that part. To change the pitch of the sounds that we create, we can actually lengthen or shorten these vocal folds to create tension. So you can see whenever she hits this big note, that would be at a different pitch because she's really stretched to those vocal folds. And so in this respect, our vocal cords kind of behave somewhat similarly to the strings of a musical instrument. Okay. So I just thought this was like a really cool clip. I like to include this one. All right, so we've talked about the larynx then. Now we're going to move down to the trachea. And so the trachea is going to extend from the larynx into the mediastinum, where it's going to divide into the left primary bronchi and the right primary bronchi. It's about, the trachea is about 4 inches long, about 3/4 inch in diameter, and it's a really, really flexible material. And in terms of the anatomy of the walls, it's actually composed by 3 layers. So if we take the trachea here and we kind of make a cut right across it, and now we're looking down the trachea. So we're looking down the trachea like such. So we are looking sort of down the trachea here. We can see that the trachea is going to be composed of 3 wall layers, kind of just like the heart was composed of 3 layers. So first and foremost, we have the deepest layer, the part that's actually going to be touching air, is called the mucosa. And this is a ciliated pseudostratified epithelium that also has goblet cells, which produce mucus. And then we have the submucosa, which is this layer with the purple stuff in there. The purple stuff is just the, different nuclei that we have within the cells here. So this is going to be connective tissue that has serum mucus glands that are supported by 16 to 20 C-shaped rings of cartilage that prevent the collapse of the trachea. And so you can see the blue here is actually going to be the C-shaped cartilage that's helping to hold open the submucosa and helping to hold open the trachea as well, because remember I said it's a very flexible structure. And then finally is the adventitia, and that's this outermost peach layer, and it's made of connective tissue, and so it's also actually going around the esophagus, which is this back here is the esophagus. So here's your food hole and here's your air hole. The functions of the trachea is one, it's an air passageway, and it also helps to clean, warm, and moisten incoming air. Okay. So I just mentioned that the trachea branches into the left primary and right primary bronchus, but that's not the only division that happens. So the air passages undergo 23 orders of this branching, and this branching is often referred to as what's called the bronchial tree. And this is what's going to create our conducting zone and our respiratory zone. So from the tips of the bronchial tree, so here we kind of have what would be considered like the tree trunk. We have the trachea being the tree trunk. And then we are going to have, I'm going to put this, I'm going to draw this on here for you. So we have the trunk tree that's going to divide into the left and right primary bronchus. And then we have the primary bronchus, you can see dividing into secondary bronchi. And then that one in. So we have secondary bronchi. And then the secondary bronchi are going to travel down and divide again into what we call the tertiary bronchi. So here's a tertiary and here's a tertiary. Okay, and so this branching continues and continues and it continues. And as we can see in this diagram, you can see the tertiary then starting to divide even further. And this tertiary is then going to divide even further as we move down. And so the really, really small sections we're going to call bronchioles. And all of this is going to lead to what are called terminal bronchioles. All right. So along the conducting zone, it's important to realize that there's some different changes that are occurring as we move down this tree. So the supporting structures change, for example, these cartilage rings that used to be on the trachea become these irregular plates. And then by the time that we reach the bronchioles, the elastic fibers that used to be up here, the cartilage that used to be up here in the trachea gets replaced altogether by elastic fibers. Also, the type of epithelium changes as we move down the tree. So we start out sort of with pseudostratified columnar epithelium that eventually gives way to, by the time we reach the bottom, cuboidal epithelium, and then squamous epithelium. And as we move down the bronchial tree, the presence of cilia, or those little hairs, and also the presence of goblet cells, which are those mucus producing cells, become more sparse. So there's really not a whole lot of them down here in the bottom of the bronchial tree. Also, the amount of smooth muscle increases along the way. And this allows the bronchioles to provide a pretty substantial resistance to air passage. And we'll talk about why that's important in the physiology section. So what we've been talking about so far has been pretty much conducting zone. So let's talk a little bit about respiratory zone. So structures of the respiratory zone are going to be the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and the alveoli themselves. So we have all of this branching that is occurring, and I told you guys that this was happening anyways. And then eventually we reach what's called a terminal bronchiole, and then a terminal bronchiole is going to split. You get my little draw tool out here. So we have this terminal bronchiole that's actually going to split into two separate respiratory bronchioles, which is what you see happening here. And then each respiratory bronchiole is going to give way to what's called an alveolar duct. And the alveolar duct is going to lead to an alveolar sac and an alveoli itself. Okay, so each individual little ball is an alveoli. The alveoli, so the little ball structures that you see, so we're going to cut one of those in half and we're going to look at the inside of it, and that's kind of what you see here down in this picture. So we're taking the alveoli and we're pretty much cutting them in half so that we can look inside of them. Okay. So when we look inside of them, what we find is what's going to be called the respiratory membrane, and that's going to be this outer lining. So this is our blood to air barrier. And basically what we have is going to be this fused alveolar wall with this fused capillary wall. So all these little circles that you see in red are the capillaries, and then all of this sort of tan colored stuff is going to be the alveoli walls, and these are super thin. This barrier is really thin. So if I'm going to take this, I'm going to zoom in on it. Here you can see the capillary wall and the alveolar wall, and this is so thin, and it's very important because this is where gas exchange is going to occur. So carbon dioxide from the red blood cells is going to diffuse. Basically what's going to happen, it's going to diffuse in. The CO2 is going to come from the blood and diffuse into the alveolus, and then we're going to put oxygen and diffuse it into the blood capillary. Okay, so again, the alveoli, this is where gas exchange is actually occurring. The alveolar walls are composed of a couple different types of cells. So type 1 alveolar cells, which are the little skinny ones that you see along the surface membrane. This is a single layer of squamous epithelium. Type 2 alveolar cells, which are the green ones that you see, secrete surfactant, which helps to lubricate the alveoli, and also secrete some antimicrobial proteins just in case there's any microbes in the blood that get sort of passed into the alveolus. These can kind of clean up the mess. Additionally, you can see that there's alveolar pores. So that's what you see, all these holes are alveolar pores. And these help to equalize pressure throughout the lungs so that the pressure is the same in all of the different alveoli, and also can provide an alternate pathway for air in case one of them were to like get blocked or something. And then you can also see these little purple cells, and these are macrophages that help to keep the alveolar surfaces completely sterile. And so believe it or not, 2 million dead macrophages per hour are carried by the cilia to the throat and are swallowed. So like whenever you cough, you have a lot of the dead macrophages come up into the throat, and then you just swallow them. And that's just their job is to make sure that the lung surfaces of the alveoli are being kept spotless. So in this last section, we'll talk about the different growth structures of the lung and the pleura. So when it comes to lung anatomy, we have the root of the lung, which is going to be where the lungs actually attach to the middle of the body. The apex is going to be this top tip point. The base is down here at the bottom that rests on the diaphragm. The hilum is the site for the entry and the exit of blood vessels and of bronchi. So if I were to take one of these lungs and detach it from the trachea, where the bronchi entered and where the vessels entered, that would be the hilum. Next, talking about the two different lungs, the left lung actually only has two lobes, so it has a superior and an inferior lobe. It has the, the oblique fissure. So I don't know why that says horizontal, but that's a note to self that should say oblique. Sorry guys, my pen is being weird. Okay, so that should say does not have a horizontal fissure because this is a oblique fissure. And then it also has this section here called the cardiac notch, which you can see the heart kind of fits nicely. The apex of the heart kind of fits very nicely into that cardiac notch. The right lung alternatively has three lobes. So we have a superior, a middle, and an inferior lobe. And it has both a horizontal fissure, which you can see is kind of going horizontally, and an oblique fissure. And oblique just means at an angle. So that is lung anatomy. So just like the heart had coverings, the lungs also have coverings, and we call the lungs coverings pleura. And so these are what's helping to lubricate and compartmentalize the lungs. So they're a thin, double-layered serosal membrane that divides the thoracic cavity into two pleural compartments and the mediastinum. The parietal pleura are here is what you see in purple, and this membrane is on the thoracic wall. It's the superior diaphragm around the heart and between the lungs. And then the visceral pleura is what's actually touching the lungs, just like the visceral pericardium was touching the heart. The visceral pleura is the membrane that's on the lung surface, and between the parietal and the visceral pleura, we have what's called the pleural cavity, just like we had the pericardial cavity. And this pleural cavity has fluid inside of it, just like the pericardial cavity did, that provides lubrication and also surface tension that helps to expand and recoil the lungs. So here is basically a summary of everything that I just talked about with the lower respiratory tract. The last couple things I'll mention here are blood supply of the lungs and innervation. So just as a reminder, we kind of already understand pulmonary circulation. So pulmonary circulation is that right side of the heart. Circulation, right? And so bronchial circulation is different than pulmonary circulation, because if you remember, we talked about cardiac circulation and that the heart has to take some of the blood for itself and deliver it to the cardiac muscle so that the heart can keep on contracting. The lungs need to do that too. They have to take some of that now oxygen-rich blood, and basically that blood gets pumped out the left heart, and some of that blood is going to be diverted to what's called the bronchial circulation. So that's going to provide oxygenated blood to the lungs themselves, and it supplies all of the lung tissue except the alveoli. At any given time, the bronchial circulation is only going to contain like 1 to 3% of our cardiac output. So a very small fraction of the blood that's leaving the heart, that's leaving the left heart specifically, actually goes to the lungs. And then once the lungs use it, they will then put it back into the right heart circulation, to the pulmonary artery, back into the lungs. And so that is blood supply of the lungs. Keep in mind, when it comes to the alveoli, things are a little bit different. So just keep in mind that the alveoli get supplied. So here's the pulmonary artery delivering deoxygenated blood to the alveoli, because the alveoli contain oxygen that you just breathed in to put on the red blood cells, so that now we have oxygenated blood leaving the alveoli via the pulmonary veins, which go again to the left heart, okay? And lastly is innervation of the lungs. So the lungs are innervated by parasympathetic and sympathetic motor fibers, and also visceral sensory fibers. So the nerves enter through the pulmonary plexus on the lung root and run along the bronchial tubes and blood vessels. So again, they're innervated by parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers, as well as some visceral sensory fibers. Here is our sympathetic innervation. We can see through the pulmonary plexus. And then here is the phrenic nerve, which is going to innervate the diaphragm. And then all of the intercostal nerves, which innervate the external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles, which are motor fibers. And then our parasympathetic innervation, again, goes to this pulmonary plexus. So parasympathetic innervation is going to cause bronchoconstriction. So your rest and digest, you're in partial bronchoconstriction, whereas when you go into fight or flight mode, your bronchioles will dilate, and so that you can breathe better if you're running for your life. So sympathetic fibers do bronchodilation. And then these motor fibers, basically their job is just to innervate the muscles that help us to breathe. So the diaphragm is our primary inspiratory muscle, so it contracts, and that's how we help to increase the volume of our lungs whenever we're breathing in, and same with the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so that takes care of the lecture portion for lung anatomy, and we will start our face-to-face lecture with lung physiology. So I'll see you then.